Hi guys. There are two things that I'd like to talk with you about today to complete our lesson on the Abbasid Caliphate. And both of these developments are going to focus on Harun al-Rashid. You remember it was his sister who had the relationship with Jafar, and the fall of the Barmakids occurred under him. And then his son al-Mamun. So there's no specific dates that I need you to focus on. But there are two distinct aspects. One is a legal aspect, and the other is an educational aspect. So first of all, I would just like to let you guys know, in general, there are three legal systems in the world. We've already looked at code law or civil law. An example of that would have been the Corpus Juris Civilis under Justinian. And in that law code, judges interpret the law as it's written down. So you remember that the Corpus Juris Civilis was divided up into many different parts, and then the judges could interpret those parts. Another type of law code that you might be familiar with is called common law, and that's the law that comes out of the Anglo-Saxon tradition. So that's the type of law code that's still used today in the United Kingdom and in former British colonies. And in common law, the decisions are based on precedent. In other words, what has happened in previous cases is given particular weight. The third type of law, which I'd like to talk with you about today, is also interpreted by judges, but instead of being based on a law code, it's based on some sort of religious teaching. So we could call this sacred law or religious law. And the specific type of sacred and religious law that I would like to look at today is Islamic religious law, which is called Sharia law. And this is actually the most widespread legal system in the world today. Most of continental Europe follows the civil law. Former British colonies follow common law, and almost all Islamic majority countries follow the sacred law, and this is specifically a type of law called Sharia law. Now, under Harun and then continued under al-Mamun, there was a specific type of Sharia law that was created, and this is called the Hanafi school of law. And this is still going to be interpreted by judges, but instead of interpreting a human-created text, they're going to be interpreting a sacred law. So obviously the first place that they'll look to make an interpretation is just in the Quran. Does the Quran say something about this specific case that they're dealing with? If the Quran does, great. Their interpretation is going to be very easy. If it doesn't, what the Hanafi school says is that they should look at the hadith, or the ahadith, the stories of Muhammad's life and teachings. If it's in one of these two sacred texts, the judge is going to have a pretty easy job. If it's not, though, his job becomes more difficult. And what Hanafi said is that you should then look for ijma, which means consensus in Arabic. If everyone can agree about the outcome, then, well, that actually is sort of based on precedent, right? If something has always been agreed on, we can continue doing it. These three are fairly straightforward. The brilliance of the Hanafi school of law is that it introduced something called Kiosk, which means analogy. Now, what this means is that you are constantly able to update your legal code to keep up with the times. So, for example, if in your religious text there is a story about a man who is dying of thirst, and he comes out of the desert, and he is desperate for food and desperate for water. If there's a story of your prophet giving him food and giving him water, even though it's during the month of Ramadan and he shouldn't be eating during the day, then a judge could make an analogy that now, in the 21st century, if you need to take your blood pressure medication, even during the month of Ramadan, that will be okay. So the key brilliance of the Hanafi school of law is that it introduces Kiosk, which allows these ancient texts and these ancient opinions to be constantly updated for today. So that's really the significant new legal code that is brought in under the Hanafi school of law. The second major thing that I'd like to speak with you about today is the creation of something called the House of Wisdom. And the House of Wisdom was a great library which was built in the new capital of Baghdad. And the most important aspect of it was the translation of texts from other languages. Obviously, the House of Wisdom was based in the Arabic tradition, but texts from throughout the Islamic Empire and throughout the Caliphate came in. And these three texts tended to be Persian texts, Indian texts. Remember, we always have to remember that the Caliphate extended out beyond the geographic bounds of our class and into India, and Greek texts. And then these were translated into Arabic at the House of Wisdom, which meant you didn't have to learn Persian, you didn't have to learn Greek, you didn't have to learn Indian. Just by studying Arabic, you would be able to interpret texts that were written in Sanskrit, in Greek, or in Persian. So this is the translation movement. And this creates just a huge explosion of creativity. So I'll just focus on one aspect and one person who worked at the House of Wisdom. That was a man whose name was Al-Khwarizmi, and he focused on mathematics. But because of the translation movement, he was able to take advantage of knowledge from throughout the Islamic world, especially in India. And one of the ideas that he got from there was the idea of zero, and of actually having a number to represent zero. And once you have a number to represent zero, that moves you on to sort of base 10 number systems, and to actually have digits and number places. So the old sort of Roman numerals are here, 1, 11, 72. But what Al-Khwarizmi was able to introduce into the Abbasid Caliphate, and then eventually into Europe in general, was having these digits. And that makes math much easier. Now, because Al-Khwarizmi introduced them to Europe, we call these Arabic numerals, but it would really be more correct to call them Indian numerals or Sanskrit numerals. What all of this allowed Al-Khwarizmi to do was to write a book, the Kitab al-Jabr, which was his book of calculation. And this calculation was based, well, I guess what he focused on was how you can do math if you don't know all of the inputs. So here is an example of an Al-Khwarizmi equation that affects your life. Here's a little equation, and this will tell you y is what you need to get on your final exam if you have x in a class right now and you still want to get a 5 in the class. So you can just input those. And that, of course, is what we would call an algorithm. And algorithms essentially were introduced by Al-Khwarizmi, so that's why we call them algorithms, Al-Khwarizmi, Al-Khwarizmi, algorithm. And Al-Jabr simply becomes the type of math, algebra. So that's just one example of how our lives were affected by the translation movement. And so those are the two big aspects that I'd like you to hold on from the Abbasid Caliphate: the introduction of a new religious law code and the synthesis that is possible with the translation movement. Thank you.